My name is Matthew Lugg, and I'm proud to be CIHT President, and I'll be chairing and help facilitate this session. And it will be interactive, so hopefully you'll be prepared to roll your sleeves up a bit and give us some contribution, because it's really what this session's all about. Just a bit about me and my background. I'm currently a director in WSP working in the local authority sector, and actually my whole career has been based in the local authority sector, predominantly working for a number of county councils as well as central government. So this is something that I know a lot about, but I'm very passionate about as well. So it's good to have this opportunity. Just see if this clicker's working. Can we have the first slide? Thank you. Yeah. And I think sometimes actually it's quite useful to know your audience. So just it'd be good just to, if you put your hands up when I ask you what background you're for. I won't go ask you to introduce yourself because we won't have time for that. So do we have many people from the public sector working in local government now? Put their hands up. Good. And then people from the consultancy side working in the public sector? Good. And a bit late then, you weren't sure. And the contracting side? Right, so we've got a good mix of people here from all sides of industry, which is really helpful in that context. So, I didn't say that we were going to do a Lugg review, although I'm delighted that it's going to be aptly called. Actually, I did a radio interview, some of you might have heard, on the Eddie Marr show back in August, when he was running a series of items on his PM programme about road maintenance. And I got interviewed to talk about, the old chestnut or ongoing chestnut about potholes. And basically my premise then was that, we shouldn't be talking about potholes. We should be talking about proactive maintenance, asset management. And actually, the problem is we don't have enough money. And it's no good government chucking money, after a bad winter. We need the money before the winter. And then I actually said, because we did talk about this beforehand, we and CIHT are going to do a review into this whole issue called the Lugg Review. So this afternoon, I'll just give you a bit of an introduction to warm you up to this, and then we can start talking about the process and the sort of information we'd be keen to try and extract from you this afternoon. And I'll be introducing our panel who are sat there, ready and waiting to be brought into this debate. So let me move on and just talk about the scope. So I want to talk about why this is important, and I'm sure all of you in this room will recognise that. I think one of the things that we want to talk to you about is, what does good look like? Ultimately, we talk about this enormous backlog, but in practice that will never be funded. But what can we achieve, and what is an appropriate level of service that could be fully funded? And in achieving that, we want to talk about the barriers. So there's all sorts of political, financial, maybe statutory. If in my view the Highways Act needs to be chucked out the window and we need a new one. It's those sort of things that maybe prevent us moving forward. And interestingly, my premise is that the current model's broken, but what's the alternative? And I think we might all have views around that, from the sort of very radical end of the scenarios to something that may be a bit more politically acceptable. So again, we want to talk to you about those aspects. And I think one of the things that I wanted to be clear about when we started this, because we do focus predominantly on roads, but actually the highway asset infrastructure isn't just about roads. And these things are all going back to what I was talking about in the previous session. These bits of infrastructure are really important to people, to help them to find a way around the network. So I think it's important that we include that, and obviously structures, when we've heard about some of the recent catastrophes elsewhere in the world, and obviously drainage. Drainage is the neglected asset, and actually it's really important for our infrastructure, because when you look at some of the pothole damage, that all relates quite often that roads aren't properly drained in the first place. So these are the things that are going to be part of the consideration. So without further ado, can I introduce our steering group?
I'm still Steve Gooding. I'm still director of the RAC Foundation, and I think what you have here is a vivid illustration of what can go wrong with technology if you rely on it too much and don't look after it.
Yeah. Apologies for that. But I think the other thing that Steve didn't tell you of, which I think is really valuable, that he was Director General in DfT, and I think having that insight into government and that political arena is going to be really helpful in sort of keeping us sort of on the straight and narrow, in terms of what we may come up with that's politically acceptable. But then, not shying away from some of the other things that we might want to talk about. And Andrew, you're next. So, hi, Andrew. It's good to have you here. And Andrew and I have known each other for a long time, but I'll let you say a bit more, maybe.
Yeah. Okay, afternoon. Andy Warrington. So currently 4 weeks into being technical director with Arcadis, helping lead their local government work, having spent almost 4 years talking quite a lot about the new code of practice risk-based approach with Atkins, and prior to that 25 years with some of it which was with Matthew in Leicestershire and some more in Nottinghamshire as well. So I think this is I think for this review, there's a great opportunity for us to stand a little bit further back from the question than perhaps we normally do. So I think we move quite quickly usually to sort of shaping the question about asking for more funding. And I actually thought the Minister this morning was really quite positive on the potential for us to get some more funding. So I'd quite like us to stand a little bit back and understand, as Matthew was saying earlier, something around the how we build confidence in government to invest that funding with us for the local roads.
Finally, Ginny, sorry, you should have been first, but
No.
you're being polite.
I chair the CIHT's Learning Society and Technical Strategy Board. So that's where actually all the technical panels, come together for CIHT. My background, as some of you probably know, I worked for Highways England. I was Chief Highway Engineer for a while there. And more recently looking at the strategy for developing things like the performance specification that Highways England now works under. This is really a burning issue for all road authorities. You might say Highways England had lots of money, what did it ever have to worry about in that context? But the reality is it isn't just about money. It is about how we see roads being part of the future and not a crumbling asset that actually isn't going to serve a purpose going forward. So I think really we're interested in the sorts of contributions that look forward about local roads and what's the best way forward.
And finally, Andrew at the back there, who isn't mic'd up, but I think he's got one to hold, is again on the steering group. Andrew.
Hi, Andrew Hugill. I'm Director of Policy at CIHT. I suppose this is close to my heart, both in a personal and professional sense, so a long career in local government in various guises. I think the thing for me is just linking it to what Matthew was talking about delivering for people. As engineers and people involved in the highway sector, we like to think of the technical aspects, but at the end of the day, our local road network delivers everything this country needs to work, and therefore we need to get it right. And that's the simple fact. And this is what this review is about CIHT as a learned society actually asking some questions that try to influence the future.
Yeah, we are seen as an honest broker. We're independent. We're not coming from any trade association or any commercial background. So hopefully, that gives us traction within government in terms of an organisation to listen to. Okay, thank you very much. So, why is this important now? You'd have seen lots of satisfaction surveys. Steve, you've been asking your customers in terms of the RAC, other motoring organisations. In the previous presentation, I talked about the NHT survey. And to be honest with you, I think public satisfaction in road maintenance is at an all-time low. And that, is a political worry, both at a local and national level. So, that's an important dimension. And I think, the important point that we should always make is about that the highway network is absolutely essential to the economy of the country. And I think we don't really articulate that particularly well in terms of the benefits of investment in highway maintenance. We seem to be able to do good business cases for new infrastructure that come up with high ratings, but in terms of recognising the importance of the road infrastructure, for that perspective, it's a really important factor. Again, in the previous presentation, I mentioned about the concern about resilience, and we're seeing more and more severe weather events that's really testing the resilience of our infrastructure. And the less maintenance we do, the more risk we have in terms of those assets, particularly our bridges, but other aspects as well. And I suppose we can all look at what's happening with Highways England and the strategic roads, and I think we could feel a bit jealous about that, because it seems to me that they're sorted. They may not feel they are, but the budget gave complete clarity for RIS2 in about 25 billion of funding for strategic roads, and I could come up with some comparators that just sort of show the stark difference, that for every kilometre spent on a local road, there's 50 times more on a strategic road. It doesn't quite feel quite right, that balance. And unclassified roads probably get resurfaced about every 150 years. These things are an issue that need to be addressed. There has been progress in terms of some aspects of the local road, looking at this new hierarchy called Major Road Network, and again it's good to get some visibility and clarity about investment. But the budget did nothing for local roads, other than yet again out of the hat came another quite a lot of money for potholes, but it was for potholes. And do that money's got to be spent by the end of the financial year? I mean, come on, is that the best use of public money at the end of the day? Sorry, I'm going to go on about that. Right. Yeah. And is anybody from government here? No. And then finally, we've got a big opportunity. So the Transport Select Committee, that should come up, are actually carrying out an inquiry, and I'm delighted that I'm going to be given oral evidence. So I think this is an opportunity to sow the seeds for what we're doing in terms of the Lug Review. Clearly, we couldn't do all this work in time for the Select Committee, but they clearly identified this as an issue. And I think the other component that I was pleased to see in that they weren't just talking about funding, because it's always the issue about funding, but they are actually asking questions about governance. And I think part of this review needs to consider that governance issue, that have we got the governance right of how we manage local roads in this country. Anyway, that's enough from me. Hopefully that's provoked a bit of thinking in terms of the background to what we're doing. I now want to sort of prompt the debate by putting some questions up and for our experts to say their views, and hopefully that will motivate some of you to express your opinions as well. Starting off with, what does good look like? So at the end of the day, if we achieved in terms of making a difference, what ultimately are we trying to achieve, I suppose, in some respects, in the difference that we could try and constitute through this process? What is exactly are we trying to achieve? So that's a very broad question, and I think we don't certainly have the answers to this, but we want to start the debate really in terms of trying to think about this, because if we don't know what we want, then it's difficult to know how we're going to achieve it, if you like, and follow that through. So I don't know if the three of you are thinking about that ready, or whether I go, Chris, you're going to save me. Go on then.
In the 19th century, parish councils looked after roads, and they couldn't maintain them, went to the county councils. And in the late 60s, we had a similar problem, and it was the Marshall Committee that reported early 70s. So for me, you need to think back at where we've come from and also where we're going. So us in this room will be moving the assets onto our successors in the future, and we only look after them for a short period of time. So it shouldn't be a short-term fix. Let's deal with it now and get on with it. It's actually sustainable long-term solutions to ensure that in the future we also have the sustainability that I think we all want.
I think we need to make sure that that's built into this review, so we're getting the quality people, we're getting the pipeline of people coming through that are able to look after those assets in the long term.
I'll just add to that as well. What's good look like, looking to the future with the change, with automated vehicles, etc., etc.
Yeah.
It's actually looking into the future rather than looking at just maintaining what we have at the moment. So it's trying to do that sort of forward horizon as well and plan for that, and that may very well be in terms of skills, but also in terms of how we manage the infrastructure into the future.
I guess for me it's just reiterating that, I guess, in terms of having a sort of steady state in terms of maintaining what we've already got, rather than a sort of food and sort of famine and feast type of arrangement that tend, not so much as a feast I guess, but in terms of trying to have more of a smooth funding stream, but also in terms of them planning for on the major schemes that come through, actually building in those maintenance arrangements that go with them forever, And when I'm talking to members about new schemes they want to build or whatever, and I'm sort of saying, well, once we've built it, maintenance is forever, and that's quite a long time.
Yeah.
And so it's certainly trying to sort of feed all that in,
Yeah.
because I say it's really hard, as you joked, but it's serious in terms of
No,
actually
sorry, I wasn't trying to be
having.
flippant.
No, but
Yeah.
you're right. I think in terms of actually throwing money at something to get a sort of short-term blip doesn't really help when you're trying to sort of have an asset management approach to getting best value for money.
Yeah, but also, thinking about that sustainability, because the funding, the capital we managed to shift government to give 5-year allocations, but it's the revenue where the grief is, isn't it? And we need to unlock that.
There is I think probably the biggest challenge when it comes to local roads, and I want to say I'm very keen that in this project we distinguish between different types of road that are serving different purposes. But the challenge, if I compare it to rail, is that when I go to Victoria Station at night and there's a signal failure, the whole line is knocked out. So there is no doubt in my mind something has gone wrong, sometimes quite a small thing, and you're not going home for quite a long time because the line is impassable. I live on a road which, to my untutored, because I'm not an engineer, eye, looks a bit like some of the Voyager pictures I've seen of the surface of the moon,
Yeah.
but I can still get across
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
I have to proceed with caution,
Yeah.
but I can still proceed. And I think that sitting as I did in Greatminster House and hearing all the tales of woe and misery and the endless alarm survey that we're somewhere between 9 and 12 billion pounds off the pace, I've always found myself thinking, well, okay, we've been hearing the alarm survey, I think, for at least 6 years now, and nothing's happened, nothing's changed, and
Yeah.
the world hasn't stopped spinning.
Yeah.
And I wanted the local enterprise partnerships particularly to be invited to take a view on this, because until such time as we've got something rather more crystallized as to, if you do not act, this is the outcome. If the outcome is we'll all have to go a little more slowly and more of us will be buying 4x4s, well, there are other problems in the world, and that's what we're wrestling with.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I sort of touched on the Highways Act, because I think there are some roads which we could challenge shouldn't be maintained at public expense. And there's, in those large rural authorities, I think, that's something that could really seriously be considered. I think the other aspect is around the legislative framework is the utilities, because of the amount of damage they cause to the road network, and they don't fully pay for that damage is another major issue. So, that's something to feed into the mix of what good might look like going forward, that, we get a better deal from those utility companies in terms of that level of compensation. Andy?
Yeah, it's sort of a risk of going off at a bit of a tangent here, as ever. I was sort of contemplating how we could help our customers, residents, road users, sort of understand themselves a little bit better of what good looks like and whether there would be some value in that. So maybe, how do we make more transparent? And I guess there's a risk of making ourselves more accountable as road maintainers, as road operators. So at the moment you can go and look at some rather high level DFT condition indicators, but that kind of doesn't tell you what the professionals think is the condition of the road that you live on, the road that you drive to work on, the road that you walk with your children to school along. So should we invest some of our existing processes, technology, in just creating a little more transparency around what we think the current condition of the road assets are? And I think we have a fairly standard process around bridge condition indicators, and maybe there's a sort of model there that we need to think about following for some of the other assets. But the key to me is, if we could inform road users and residents what we, the professionals, think the current condition of the asset is, then our customers could perhaps inform us around what they think good looks like, and actually some mid-condition may actually be okay for them.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, one of the things we may want to talk about, there is no road regulator, so there is no overseeing organisation at a national level holding local authorities to account in terms of what they do. And then we get that complete disparity between local councils. and as you drive around, you could be looking at a completely different standard as you go from one road to another across boundary. So that may be a consideration. I suppose the other thing, Andy, in the work you're doing about risk-based approach, it does seem to me that it's pushing us to the bottom, in terms of the standards that we have, and it tends to be looked at a local level. So it could breed further inconsistency, which the public will just not understand.
Yes,
Anyway,
I think I could spend quite a lot of time rebutting that particular challenge, Matthew, but I think it's a separate debate. I think there is a key constraint if you are looking at managing your local network much more on a risk basis and analysing those risks. The constraint of the Highways Act 1980 as it reads at the moment. So I think that was a really valid point in your opening, actually.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. Ginny, are you still there?
Yeah. I'd probably come to it with both a technical background. I'm interested to understand technically what a good road would look like going forward. But to answer that question, it's not for me to say, actually, should it all be capable of carrying HGVs or not HGVs? Are we going to segregate the road network so that then we create a road condition that's actually suitable for the traffic we're going to put down it? I think we're in the middle of the question there. We've got to step back, particularly now when the conditions of roads are deteriorating in some areas quite considerably below any sort of technical judgment about whether that's a good condition. And I think we've got to attain an asset that's actually serving something that people don't necessarily want anymore. And I think what does good look like? I think you do have to go back to the people who use the network. And it's us in our daily lives, but it's also those who service what we want from our communities. And I think it's important that we get that dialogue much more substantiated with a quantified effect of people's view about what they want. We'll be quite good as technical people to try and explain what that means, like whether it's the condition of the road, whether your lighting columns are all going to be lit all the time, whether the drainage is going to work. I've just come through the most tremendous downpour out there. Roads flooded. Is this not something we really ought to be worrying about as much as whether the condition of the road, meets a certain index? And I think there's a place for the technical, but we're sadly missing that view about what the future use of the network is going to be. Yeah. And I think it's those questions that really need a bit more detail.
Okay, I spotted Steve's hand go up first, but I'll come to you in a moment, sir. Steve, yeah.
So a couple of things that comments prompted me to want to feed in. So one is the current National Road Condition Index is a heap of rubbish. I know that because I used to publish it. And it does the thing that national data often does. It aggregates data to a point where it means nothing to anybody.
Actually, we've got Chatham House rules in here.
There's only one Chatham House rule, which is things aren't attributable. And since I'm the only person here who did publish that, I think you've got me. But the thing is, what we need, when we're thinking about road users, we need to be thinking a bit creatively about what their ask is of the network. Because how an engineer, I know this, how engineers think about condition and how users think about it are just completely different. The other thing that I would say is, I think we've got to be quite cautious about the question we ask. If you ask me what good looks like, I was thinking, if we were talking about what car I would like to have, I can tell you what good looks like. It looks remarkably like a Jaguar F-Type. If you ask me what good enough looks like if I have to pay for it, it looks a bit more like a second-hand thing.
Okay. Well, I think we're sort of thinking about that perspective in terms of what is going to be acceptable at the end of the day. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Barry Durkin from Herefordshire Council. I'm intrigued by this thought about how we stop vehicles, if I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly, using certain roads, because we are a rural authority and we have tractors, 44-ton tractors, and we have heavy goods vehicles, all using our roads, which up to about 80 years ago were just cart tracks. Yeah. So how do we actually go forward with substandard roads which haven't got the substrate that's required to take these heavy goods vehicles? Because unless we actually can control these vehicles, which
Yeah.
I don't think there will be a wit or the wisdom to do it,
Yeah.
we are always going to be catch-up.
Okay. No, it's a good point. Thank you, Phil.
Thanks very much. Phil Carey, Transport Focus, which isn't far from being a roads regulator, but is just a user watchdog when it comes to the Highways England network. I really want to sort of take my cue from Ginny's comments and indeed from what Andrew H. was saying earlier around the importance of delivering for people. And it's also delivering for organisations, in particular perhaps just other parts of the local authority, the local services around education,
Yep.
adult social
Yeah.
care, refuse collection, absolutely depend on a decent quality local road network serving all the properties, all the locations. And I just wonder how far there's scope from a local authority side to sort of build up the arguments from other services, other sort of functions of the authority, get them to recognise that a certain minimum level of performance from the network is essential for them to rationalise, to pursue the service in the way they want to.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And I suppose, I don't know if you were in when I went through the steering group, but we do have Mike Goodall-Jones from Somerset County Council. So we're very much trying to pick up that wider sort of local authority perspective. So we just want to talk to you about the barriers. So I guess, if you did some sort of SWOT analysis or pest analysis, you come up with some of these aspects. But it'd be good just to discuss these in a bit more detail, because in terms of those barriers, how can we sort of break those barriers to try and look at this in a different way? So I suppose, just to get the ball rolling, I talked initially about political, talked about governance, talked about funding, talked about legislation. So those are sort of things that I see as barriers. There may be others that you have a view. So does anybody want to kick us off on that?
Personally, I feel a bit of an oddbod because I'm very proud to be a highway engineer. I'm proud to work with people like you guys, but how many are there giving that message out? It's a great industry and we do a lot for people, but we can do a lot to promote the people coming in as well.
I always think about the pub test. Do you really want to tell people in the pub what you actually do?
Yeah.
But, we should go out there and say, well, we do all this brilliant stuff. So,
Get the right people in doing the right jobs.
No, good point. Thank you.
Localism, believe it or not, it's still around, and the Conservative politicians are very keen still on localism, albeit I'm not sure where it's going. Another one is about the Highways Act and stopping up public highway, and you mentioned about some of these rural roads.
Yeah.
I remember 30 years ago trying to close roads, and the NFU was saying, no, you can't do that. So there has to be a mechanism to actually get rid of some of the highway network that we presently have and we don't need. And I think funding is a big issue. Whether we like it or not, we're never ever going to have the right amount of funding. So what is those funding? It is a barrier, as far as I can see, to actually where we may want to go. Yeah.
We used to go in saying, well, why can't we hypothecate? Oh, Treasury will never do it. And they flipping well did for vehicle excise duty. So, you might think you're sort of hitting your head on a brick wall, and all of a sudden there's a breakthrough. So, yeah.
I think there's a thing about resource, particularly in people. And I think just from an observation through my career is you see that resource moving around the sector. And it's like the old quote, was it Watergate, about follow the money? So actually resource goes into where the money is. Yeah. And I think therefore you see a shift in recent years towards a strategic network, which is absolutely welcome. But actually that needs balancing out. So there's two aspects for that. One is get the funding right for local highways. But actually the other side to it is to make sure that that's got a continuity and certainty that allows both local authorities or local highway authorities and the people that work for them, whether actually work for them or are consultants, actually the certainty to invest in that service. Because I think at the moment, and I can only look into the local authority world, I would suspect that the lack of revenue funding at the moment is meaning the people with the most experience are leaving because they're a high revenue cost.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely the wrong thing to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
if you're trying to get a good service. So I think there's that resource issue we need to
Yeah, no,
sort.
I think we've touched on sort of resource and skills a few times, so it's a good point.
I'm always wishing we didn't ask this question, actually, because I think it almost puts you in the wrong frame of mind. Because I think I've said, whether it's this study or some other studies I'm involved with, what are the solutions rather than what are the barriers?
Are they coming next?
Good. But I will, on the basis that the question's been asked, I think it's both a resource, a people resource, but it's also the training of those people. Because I actually do believe this is not just an engineering problem. This is a problem about movement. It's a problem about safety. It's a problem about public health. There are a number of issues here. And I think any successful local authority looking inwards, where there are successes, is where they've managed to bring those different skills together to find what's the best balance between these other barriers, which are funding, availability of resource, whatever. Because actually the most effective local authorities appear to be those that can actually bring lots of skills together to try and get the right service being provided here. So I think a barrier is that we're probably a little narrow in our thinking sometimes.
Yeah. What you said, Ginny, what are the solutions? So that's a very, very broad question, and I think we get into the nub of maybe this review that in fact we all know there's a problem and we can all articulate that to a degree, but I think this is where hopefully we can make the difference in terms of coming up with some ideas around alternatives that maybe things that haven't really been raised or thought through before. So does anybody want to kick us off on this one? Okay. So I think one of the things that we must do as part of this review, and actually through CIHT we've got good access to the World Road Association, is look internationally, because the problem we're facing in this country is similar across the world, particularly in the developed countries. And people are managing this in a different way. So I'll just go straight into, and Andy's here who worked in New Zealand. I've done some work in New Zealand, and New Zealand hypothecate their fuel duty for road maintenance. And I think if you want to see some of the best asset management in the world, go to New Zealand. They're not a country that generate a lot of money, but they do look after their highway infrastructure incredibly well. So that's one example, and there may be others in other parts of the world.
Technology has moved forward. The user pays, so you basically you people are paying to use the road. So freight to use it pay rather more because they do more damage, etc. And of course, all that becomes quite controversial potentially.
Yeah,
but it does get you back, and politically, but it does get you back to the doctrine that the user does pay.
Yeah.
And hypothecating, absolutely, that's certainly a view I would have, in that you have got the money for what is a hugely important public service, without which education, health, and all other ones begin to look rather more feeble.
I'd just like to get people's thoughts on whether we can continue with the current model of local authorities managing and running road networks, or whether we should have some form of national transport body that looks after the entire road network, so you haven't got umpteen number of procurement processes with cost going through all the time, whether you haven't got huge numbers of people doing the same jobs and duplicating as well.
Just picking up on what Matthew said before about from New Zealand, I'll give you a little bit of a Nirvana idea out there. Their legislation doesn't allow for third-party claims to highway authorities at all. You trip up, you should have looked where you were going, mate. That's the attitude they've got down there.
I like that.
It was completely refreshing from me coming from a local authority in the UK to go to New Zealand, where you went over a pothole. Oh, well, you should have a 4x4, shouldn't you? But the nirvana is the legislation in the UK too biased to allow people to claim, and that drives a lot of the behaviours and a lot of the levels of service that we actually do. Could that money and that energy be better spent on other things if there was a slightly different approach? Now, I'm not saying we don't undertake our duties correctly, but legislation in the Highways Act will never change, I very much doubt. But it was it was a refreshing thought when I was there.
But we have done quite a bit of work, and I think I'm not going to comment on any of the points raised, because I think they're all perfectly legitimate, because the value of a professional institution doing a study like this is that there are no boundaries. You don't have to apply the sort of self-denying ordinance that you would in, say, a government department when you're thinking of what's the art of the politically possible for this minister in this job, in this parliament. You can be thinking, and you picked up a while ago, Matthew, about the fact that I would have said 10, 15 years ago, if you'd asked me, will there ever be a Chancellor of the Exchequer who's willing to hypothecate vehicle excise duty? I'd probably have said no. But opinions change, times change, and the key thing for the sort of study that the CIHT is doing is to have laid the groundwork of thinking so that if that moment comes, there are some good ideas on the table. Now, we've talked a bit about New Zealand. All I'd observe is, for those of you who want to be entertained, at about 2 o'clock, you'll hear Steve Norris talking about private finance for roads. I guarantee you he will talk about fuel duty falling off a cliff. And at some point in the next little few years, he's right. Because we're going to go electric, one form or another. Might be hydrogen, might be plug-in, whatever. But it's not going to be fossil fueled. And at that point, if you're in New Zealand, you definitely want an electric 4x4.
Okay, that's good. Very good point. Yeah. Any other comments from panel on this one? Ginny?
I've always been tempted to say I'd like to take over the whole road network, please, and give it the sort of consistent approach for the 100,000 miles as much as you could do for the 10,000 miles or whatever. So I think there is something about, let's have something that tries to say a road is a road. It doesn't matter whether it's in the north of England or the middle of England, whether it's rural or whether it's urban. What are the things that actually we need to do that are important about keeping this road available for whatever forms of transport it is? And I equally go with the rural side, because I don't think this is about cutting off the fact that there seem to be a few people in certain areas and they're not worthy of providing a service. You've got to provide the service for everybody in this country. It might be a different level of service or it might be done in a different way, but you've got to provide services. And I think this is the sort of thing that I'd be looking for, is an authority that can oversee that.
Okay, a few hands going up on that, Ginny. So,
I knew it would.
Can I just directly respond to that?
Yeah.
That wasn't my proposal to give a dual service, if you like. My point was that every road in my county is used by HGVs at one time or another, and they are of substandard construction because they are not roads, they're boats and the like. And the expectation of the public is it is tarmac, therefore it is a road, therefore you will repair it.
Yeah.
And that's the problem with it. And going back to something you said earlier on, a vital part of what should be done is education of those that don't know.
Yeah.
It's about people to understand that, yes, it's a road, but,
yeah.
you know.
Do you know, I used to know what a boat stands for, but I've forgotten.
Byway open to all traffic.
Thank you. Okay, Steve wants to come back, and I know, Andy, you want to speak as well. Or you. Did you want to say something? No? Stephen?
Yeah.
Oh, there's one down here?
Over there. Well, I was just going to lift a little bit of a veil on the steering group for the project, and so I'm not going to disagree with Ginny. I'm just going to amplify what she was saying, because I think a road is not a road wherever it is. And whilst I would say there's a case for a degree of national consistency, and we wouldn't argue for that, I'm pretty confident anyone in this room who's dealt with local councillors will know they would not want me in my former life in Greatminster House in London deciding what the quality of roads should be in their authority. But my point is this, let's come back to what do we want from our road and what do we mean by quality of service. The road that in the house where I grew up in southeast London, if you ask the people down that road the things that most concern them, it isn't the fact that it's potholed and patched to hell. It isn't the fact that it's got a really quite fierce adverse camber that makes it quite hard to open the car door. It's the fact that it's quite near a railway station and every other bugger wants to park there and you can't.
Yeah.
So if you ask them, give me 3 things that you really want to be true about your road, my suspicion is the condition of the surface wouldn't make it into the top 3. And that's why we need to start thinking a bit laterally about the sort of road and the service it provides. But that might not be true in other places.
Yeah. Okay, so a good point to Nick again, yeah?
I'll support the point that Ginny made, actually, but in a slightly different way, I guess, in terms of being consistent, that certainly on a Highways England road, where it's obviously a business case is put forward and it's funded, on the major road network or on other road that the local authority is promoting, you have to put an element. You make a business case, you get some funding, but it's not fully funded by DFT / central government. Certainly, I know in Norfolk, where we built a £200 million northern bypass, we had to put £50 million of our own money in to get that. Whereas, compared to the A47 improvements or whatever, that clearly are going to benefit the public in the same way, that are going to be fully funded by others. So it's about a consistency of funding across the board.
Andy from WSP arguing a case for doing away with third-party claims. I mean, I think that's possibly the only channel of redress that users have against highway authorities at the moment, and it really just sort of highlights the absence of any sort of broader thinking on the part of highway authorities, and this includes Highways England as well, that they are providing a service. Perhaps the highway authority should be explaining a little bit about how to use the network, which bits aren't going to be appropriate for HGVs, etc., in a sort of clearer, more consistent way. And this is all against the backdrop of ever stronger delay repay type reimbursement arrangements on certainly rail use, if not public transport use more broadly. And I think highlighting the need to look again at the service contract that highway authorities provide and do better than just having to rely on third-party claims.
Where I come from, the road condition is really absolutely 100% the thing people are most unhappy about, particularly for cyclists and anybody at a road junction which is ropey and breaking up. And I think, at the moment, as I understand it, this so-called hypothecation is purely money from the Road Fund licence to Highways England, which is ludicrous. And I just hope that ADEPT and the local authorities make absolutely clear that shouldn't go on, because it is basically what most people want is properly maintained local roads, right down to the D roads, but particularly in suburban areas and some rural areas which are in the Greenbelt are really terrible. And Martin Tetz County is probably the worst.
We're at a time now where Highways England is starting to think very clearly and articulate its hierarchy of motorways, expressways. We've now got the major road network that we're waiting to hear what that will look like and confirm what that will look like. It's maybe the opportunity to actually think about, we seem to lump together the local highway network as one thing, and it clearly isn't. It clearly is the rural roads that need farm vehicles and HGVs going down them. It's high-speed rural roads, and in towns and cities it's streets, which we class as highways. So the work CIHT did around shared space, when it reviewed what local authorities were looking at as shared space schemes, the transport vehicle element was only a tiny part of it. And actually that understanding what the purposes of those areas bits would be a very good alternative to tell people what they are.
I'll just throw this hand grenade because I'm not going to have any time for any other questions. But, if you wind the clock back, and some of you may remember this 30 years ago, most of your utilities were in the public sector, and they're now all privatised. Isn't that possibly something we could do with local roads in terms of this context of how they're managed going forward? Food for thought. Obviously, we need to put some boundaries around this because we haven't got a load of people in CIHT who are going to do all this work. It's going to be me and a few others. So we are going to have some limitations, but nevertheless, we're going to try and do a thorough job. But we really want to make sure we hear your views and make sure we've got something that people can rally behind in terms of trying to influence, particularly that pot of money going forward. And we're not quite sure what we're heading for at the moment. There's some talk there might be an annual spending review, it might be a longer term, but nevertheless, we just feel now's the moment to go for this. So, hopefully we'll let you know how we get on. That's the process we're going through. And as you've heard today, we've got a very capable team to help us. So thank you very much for coming along and listening and contributing. It's been good to hear that.